Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So Blizzard have basically just posted about some itemization updates that they've got for patch 6.2. Now, one thing is good, and the rest of it is, well, it's got a nice idea, but it's potentially not very good at all. I'll get into that in detail, but first of all, I'll just cover the one bit of, I suppose, goodish news. Personal loot is being improved. It's going to essentially be a bit more competitive with group loot because the amount of gear that drops will be based on the group size, and in addition to that, they've got a new UI so you can see the other things that have dropped, which is definitely kind of nice. They also said they're slightly increasing the drop rate to basically compensate for the fact that you can't pass the loot around. That will probably be a bit tricky in terms of getting the numbers right, and I hope that it doesn't mean that, say, at the very start of a raid tier, that personal is technically better, since, well, everything would be an upgrade at the start of a tier. Not sure about personal loot, but in terms of the other changes, we have far bigger fish to fry. So first, they're going to be shaking up secondary stats, such that items don't always have a 50-50 split between their two stats. Basically, the kind of range of secondary stats in terms of their balancing is going to be a lot higher. So for an example, say you could have an item that would have 75% of stat X and 25% of stat Y. They've said that this, in combination with tuning stuff so that our attuned stats, they're the ones that we get a maybe 5% bonus on, are always the best, is going to make the gearing decisions a bit more clear. Now, in theory, I get what they're going for here, but in reality, can they actually do balancing that's going to mean that those secondary stats are always the best? That's a really big if based on their balancing of secondary stats in the past, and I'd say the chances are this will work out great for some specs, but some other specs will be in a really strange place. So that's a bit odd, but let's move on to the main sort of topic of the day, and that is the item level changes. So what they're going to do is basically increase the item level throughout the progression of a raid. So for Heroic, it starts at 705 for the first 4 bosses, then moves to 710 for the next 4 bosses, then moves up to 715 for the next 2 bosses, and then finally Archimond drops 720 gear. So essentially, as you move through the raid within a single difficulty level, the gear that you get from subsequent bosses overall does increase in item level. So the first boss is going to drop a lower eye level than the last boss. In theory, I like this idea, and it would appear that it would sort of meet Blizzard's goal of making gearing remain exciting as you progress through the raid. However, there are a bunch of problems, most of which seem to stem from loot distribution and kind of various things like that. The more hardcore and involved raiding community has kind of jumped on this and torn the whole thing to shreds. I think that, you know, there is some worth in the idea, but there are definitely a massive amount of problems. And given how I think patch 6.2 is probably going to come out quite soon, or at least will have to, I don't know if they've got enough time to really make something like this work. It's kind of late in the PTR cycle to really start talking about this stuff. So what's really going to be key for the success of this system is the distribution of trinkets and weapons, because these are the things which have the biggest effect on your DPS. Currently, there is an imbalance in the item levels, meaning that some classes get access to certain item levels of weapons earlier or later than others. Hell, right now there's even a problem where, for an example, there's not a eye level 720 ranged weapon in the whole raid, whereas there is a 720 two-handed sword that drops from Archimond. This imbalance seems really off, and we see many examples of similar things going on with loads of different trinkets and weapons. Another odd thing about Archimond actually is that normal Archimond drops the same item level as the first 4 bosses of the raid on Heroic difficulty. Now, as far as the weapon loot goes, Archimond drops a 705 two-handed sword on normal difficulty, yet the first boss of Heroic drops a 705 ranged weapon. And chances are that the first boss of Heroic is going to be way easier than normal Archimond, yet the two-handed sword users won't have access to a 705 two-handed weapon until the 4th boss, which is a bit strange. Now, to carry that example on further, if we're going from, from Heroic to Mythic, there is a item level 720 two-handed weapon available. However, For heroic raiders that aren't going to be going into Mythic, for an example, if you're a hunter that cares about a ranged weapon, tough luck. You can't get a 720 ranged weapon without jumping into the first 4 bosses of Mythic difficulty, which of course is very different from hopping from normal to heroic. That just seems a little bit strange, and basically the whole thing is a bit confusing. I'm sure that listening to what I'm saying here is going to be confusing. I had to write a lot of it down to actually do this video because there's just so many things that jumble around in my head. Another thing about Archimonde is that he drops class trinkets, which means that everyone's going to get a trinket off him. Thing is though, that due to the trinket design of these trinkets, they're not always the best for every single spec by the current looks of things, which again is going to lead to some problems with how it ties into the item levels. Overall, basically, due to the gear distribution, this could mean that some classes are flat out better due to more convenient access to key bits of gear, which is a really odd system, and it could lead to a lot of class stacking and various things like that in the progression rating scene, but I'd say perhaps to more of a degree than currently it happens. Right now, yeah, item level, or, loot tables do sort of influence that, but also balancing influences that. Well, now you could end up with classes that are balanced in such a way and have gearing in such a way that they're just ideal for progression, which could kind of mess things up just a little bit. Now, I do think the idea of Archimonde dropping class trinkets is actually really cool, but I think they need to ensure that they are always the best for each spec in question, which is going to be a mighty hard thing to do. Also, Archimonde should either drop weapons for all classes or weapons for none, as far as I'm concerned, because I think that imbalance where, for an example, not everyone has access to an item level 720 weapon without hopping into Mythic difficulty is just really silly. Yeah, not that good. And, I would have thought that the loot tables currently were not finished. However, when I hopped onto the PTR, I found that all of the bosses had their item levels, changed in accordance with this stuff, and everything that I say in this video is based off the current loot tables. And I actually saw on Twitter the devs try to explain a situation with shaman weapon availability, and they actually cited the current loot tables, which would suggest that it's currently their kind of most up-to-date working version, and one that they are willing to maybe sort of defend and stand by. So it does seem odd, and as far as I'm concerned, they need to completely rework these loot tables to make them make a lot more sense. Especially for the progression guilds, it's going to lead to just a lot of strange antics. Now, the pairing of the slanted secondary stat stuff in combination with this item level change could make for just gearing being even more unclear to people. What if you, say, get a weapon with a lower item level, but secondary stats that slant more towards one of your better stats? Is that going to be better than a higher item level but worse secondary statted weapon? How are you going to work that out? Well, you're going to go on to Ask Mr. Robot. Then when you throw Warforged and gem slots in on top of all of this stuff, it's just going to make statting things, or, like simulating things out, an absolute necessity, which I think is really strange. There are going to be so many item levels within a single tier of rating that I think it could potentially be a lot more confusing than past systems. Another issue is that tier gear might actually end up being a lower item level than other bits of gear within the same difficulty. Going back to that heroic example, the heroic tier gear is currently 710, yet some heroic bosses drop 715 gear and heroic Archimonde drops 720 gear, which isn't really that great. There are probably some other problems, but that's most of what I can think of so far. I really do like the idea that they're going for, though I think it is a pretty cool one. One of the issues that they cited was actually people getting sort of later on into Blackrock Foundry and actually just disenchanting bits of gear right off the bat because they didn't really need it, because of course it was the same item level as some of the stuff from the start of the raid. And stuff like that certainly would be, helped or fixed by what they're trying to implement here, but I would like to make the point that the reason why I personally have cared less about certain later on bosses is that I already have the gear from them through the Garrison raid missions. A lot of people say that that stuff's so sparse it doesn't matter, but for maybe the average guild which takes 3 months or so to clear a raid, or maybe even a little bit more, that's 6 to 8, maybe 10 bits of gear from the Garrison chests. By that time, by the time you actually get to those later bosses, there's a good chance you'll actually have some of their gear, which I think messes up the progression curve quite a bit. So if they were going to make this whole system work, the secondary stats would have to be balanced perfectly, which is a massive challenge, especially, you know, in combination with all of this increasing item level stuff. They might have to go with the sort of first weapon in the raid tier being low item level with bad stats, the middle one being a middle item level with maybe a 50-50 stat split, and then the later weapon being a 75-25 stat split towards your best stat, and then also a higher item level. However, multiple specs share the same weapon, so how are you going to get that to work? It's going to be very hard. They also need to ensure that all classes have got every single gear slot, especially the trinkets and the weapons, covered in every single item level bracket within a difficulty range. For trinkets, they're also going to have to manage the effects such that you don't end up with the worst effect trinket having the highest item level, because that's just not going to feel that good, is it? Even if they do try to do this stuff, then, you know, many of the specs share trinkets. How are they going to be able to balance that? I don't think they're going to be able to, if I'm honest. They should also make tier gear a competitive item level with the best gear that's available in the raid. So for an example, that's making tier gear competitive with the stuff that drops off the last few bosses and then Archimond. I don't think it's a very good design where players are getting their tier sets and then finding that within the same difficulty level, they're getting higher item level bits of gear. I don't think it feels that good having to maybe drop your 2-piece or drop your 4-piece because a better bit of gear has came along. And on the other side of the coin, I don't like the idea of having to maybe shard a better bit of gear because you don't want to break your 4-piece. It's a bit strange because of the increasing item levels. I think the best way to make this work is to have the tier gear have an item level that is equal to that of the highest eye level armor within a given difficulty. That way people can still keep 4 pieces of their tier gear and then just swap around with that kind of final slot with a bit of well-statted, you know, like sort of offset high item level gear. It's overall just a very strange system. I think it's got really good intentions, and the problem that they're trying to solve, as far as I'm concerned, is a problem that they themselves have created. What they've done is they've added in more things like gem slots. They've added in just so many variables that I think are messing up gear. You know what, back in the day, how I knew that perhaps, I don't know, like a later on bit of gear, you could make it more powerful by just putting an extra gem slot on it. And you wouldn't need to dick around with all this item level stuff. You could just stick your gem slot in and people would know, ah, well, that later on bit of, or that later on weapon, for an example, has 2 of, you know, the right kind of gem slot that gives me a bonus, which is really nice. I know that that's the weapon that I want to shoot for based on my class. Stuff like that, I think, worked in a far better way, and this whole idea, I think, of the garrison raid mission gear eroding from the later on progression of the raid is, I think it's something that's a major issue in Warlords of Draenor. I haven't seen that many other people talk about it, but it just seems like they've kind of, in that attempt that they made to maybe Diablo-ify some of the gear and make it more exciting in some ways, what they've actually done is they, I think for many people, have made it more confusing. Yes, in the previous system we had a lot more busy work to do in terms of flying around, getting our gear like reforged, getting our various enchantments on and things like that. But right now what's happening is, well, you end up with a bag that's just full of bits of gear for all your different specs, and then you've got to get add-ons and various things like that. Go to Ask Mr. Robot, because gear now has so many variables that it's very hard to tell what's good and what's bad. Then, of course, there were all of these secondary stat issues that were, I think, very prevalent at the start of the expansion, but people have more got used to at this stage. It's a bit of an odd system. I think, while, you know, it's got good ideas, I don't really have faith in Blizzard pulling it off, and I do worry that if they keep on going with this system, that it might damage the raiding community quite a bit. We've seen a lot of guilds kind of break apart during Blackrock Foundry for whatever reason. I think Preach actually did quite a good video on that a while ago. And if a lot of those guilds come back for BRF and just find like itemization and gear and all that stuff's weird and broken, then it might be, like, I think it would be stupid to say, oh, it'll be the nail in the coffin for raiding. No, that's silly, that's just clickbait. But it may put more of a dent in that sort of scene of the game. And with PvPers not getting any new content, well, what's left? Some Apex's missions in Tanan. So let me know what you think, and I'll be back onto some more sort of effort-intensive content. As of tomorrow, a video got a little bit delayed because of a funeral and various things like that, but After that, and after my exam Monday, I will hopefully be 100% back on YouTube. It just some IRL stuff popped up. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks for watching the video, everyone, and I will see you next time.